Thank you so much for the introduction. I always feel a bit sheepish when I hear someone reading the bio that I've provided them of me. I don't know, Christian, is that a thing that you're feeling also? It's like, oh, but hi, everyone, welcome. It's so great to be here. I'm in my summer quarter right now, and I'm actually not teaching. So this is the first group of people I've been around in probably about 4 weeks. So I'm loving this. I'm feeling super energized by seeing all of your smiles right now. And it's a joy to be here. Gideon, I think you told them just about all of the superficial stuff about me, but I'll be digging in more on my story as a writer, researcher, scholar as the presentation continues. But Christian, did you want to say a few words about yourself also?
Sure. I am so honored to be doing this with Dr. Speciale, and I love the CRLL, and I love the work that y'all are doing, particularly for our profession, because this is important, right? And I think of it as like the ways that we're cultivating resources and professional development that offers a public resource, right, for our profession, because I think in so many ways, so many of our counselors, our counselor educators, our counseling students don't quite have access to everything that sometimes we set up barriers, right? Ironically, for a profession that focuses on multiculturalism and social justice. So I think in many ways we're doing our best to share in this community and share in these connections in a way that's my hope transformative. So
Yes. And again, how apropos, right, for a topic such as this. I think there's a quote that immediately comes to mind that comes to mind a lot these days. I think Ernest Hemingway said, "There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed." That has certainly been my experience. I know that just getting started in the field a few years back, I had a lot of questions that I really didn't know how to, I didn't really even know how to form them with my mouth. I didn't know how to ask the questions. I didn't know who to ask. All I knew was that being a writer, being a researcher felt like an unattainable task. It felt like an identity that was not mine. And I imagine that a lot of my peers and colleagues were feeling very similarly, but there was definitely, I think, a sense of imposter syndrome that limited me from reaching out and building kind of community early on around those feelings of just not knowing what the heck we're doing when we first start this process of developing our writer researcher identity. So when Gideon reached out to me, and I recognized that I was going to be working with Dr. Chan. I thought to myself, this is something that I would have loved to have participated in, during my doc program, if not before, during my master's or even undergraduate program, because writer researcher identity is something that develops over time, right? You don't just wake up one day, you don't just defend your dissertation and say, "That's it, everyone. Welcome. I'm in the world. I'm Dr. Speciale, and I'm a writer." This is something that for a lot of folks, especially folks that are doing a lot of teaching and aren't spending as much time on their researcher element once they get into a professor job or a counselor educator job, it can be a slower moving process and a lot of twists and turns and perhaps not a central place to really learn more about that process and what it might look like for yourself. So again, we're really happy to be here to be able to at least talk to you about our journeys, right? It may not it may not be a specific match with yours, but Christian and I, let's see, I've been an assistant professor now for 5 years. I'm going up for tenure and promotion this year. Right, I don't want to jinx it. And then before that, 4 years as a PhD student. So I've been writing now academically, for about 9 years, which is kind of bizarre. And I think this is the first time that I've said that out loud. But along the way, have really been inadvertently focusing on finding my voice. What does my voice sound like as an academic? Is it, what is acceptable and not acceptable for my voice? And those are really tough questions that have a lot to do with our values, our identities, our goals, and what we want to accomplish with our voice. Let's see. I wanted to start off today when Dr. Chan and I were kind of talking to prep for today's meeting. I think the first thing that we both really agreed on was that we wanted today to be as collaborative as possible. And, you know, I don't think anyone in here is going to benefit from Christian and I talking at you for 90 minutes. What we hope to accomplish with today is a dialogue, to invite dialogue, to invite questions, to invite your experiences, because I can assure you that this collective group has so much more to teach than I do. So let's try and accomplish that today. I think one of the first things that we can do to maybe invite some audience participation is I'm actually going to give you guys about 3 minutes. We're going to do a quick write. So this is on the nose for a writing presentation. I apologize. But with our first 3 minutes to get us started, let's do a quick write. And this can just be handwritten. It can be typed on your computer, whatever you have available to you. Think about what you hope to get from today's presentation. So I want you to think about your questions related to writing. This can be academic writing. It can also be creative writing if that's a goal of yours. Christian and I both dabble in the creative writing arts. So what are the goals that you hope to obtain in today's training? Lori, come on in.
One of the things that I wrote was part of my issue with writing is I like to write the perfect sentence from the start. And I have a hard time just writing for the sake of writing and then going back and editing or refining. So are there any tips that you have where I can let go of that perfectionism and, start from a different place perhaps?
Mm-hmm. As you were just saying that, Lori, I saw a few people in here smile and start to nod with you. I was feeling that as well, but I was also feeling a tinge of anxiety because I relate so much to the question that you just described. So yes, okay, so I just wrote a quick note that the writing process and this feeling of perfectionism, I mean, how many folks in here can relate to Lori sharing that? I mean, maybe she's her biggest critique. She's her, or, she stands in her own way around writing. I know I can certainly identify with that. Okay. Thank you so much, Lori, for sharing that. That's absolutely something that we'll be talking about today. Carol.
So one of mine is very similar to yours, Lori. And I struggle with being efficient versus feeling like I'm spinning my wheels. So it's as a practical way of phrasing it, I hope to learn, is it best to start with an idea of what the journal wants, or to start with what you want and then shape that into what the journal wants? Just bringing it to a very, where the rubber meets the road place. I struggle with that,
Yes, absolutely. My first answer to that question, the first thing that came to mind was, well, it depends on where you're at in your promotion and tenure process. Yes, absolutely. So I hear your question, which is, how strategic do we get with the types of ideas that we choose to pursue? Do we want to tailor our research to something palatable and attractive to an academic journal? Or do we want to start with what our passions are and then perhaps find an academic journal that matches those passions? Yeah. In typical counselor fashion, I say it depends. But I'm making a note for us to actually talk more about that later on. That's a great question, Carol. I also see in the chat, James was asking more about, again, the process of writing, but starting from conceptualization, but actually creating action research that creates and contributes toward positive social change. So that pacing, yes, pacing. So I hear two questions here, definitely. James, it sounds like you're interested in wondering, like, how can we have the most bang for our buck? How can we make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze when it comes to developing a research project and writing up the resultant manuscripts? As well as, you know, what does that pacing structure look like? How do we ensure that we're sticking to a timeline that is manageable for us and our co-authors? Absolutely. And Christian, yes, speeds of the review process. We don't have a lot of control about that, do we? Do you want to speak to that, Christian?
Sure. I was about to type a comment here that we can also discuss the culture and visions of certain outlets. And so I think for some, we sort of run into issues with trying to figure out what would be most efficient, because there are some journals where you might wait a year into the review, waiting for it to render, waiting for the editorial board and the editor to render a decision on your manuscript. So there's that piece. And then there's also the other piece where I was explaining this actually to a mentee this morning, where one of the other pieces in the timeline, right? So just like what Dr. Speciale was saying, especially if you're on the promotion and tenure track, or on the tenure track, that if you're looking at that, sometimes the timing, you have to factor in that it's not just a review process. So you may get something accepted and it's now in press, but it could take another year before it goes into an issue, like into print. And so you have to figure out with your institution, what will count and what will not count, right? I mean, most places are probably going to look favorably upon some work that says, okay, it's in press, that means it's been accepted, so we know it's going to print at some point. But at the same time, it's also like making sure that there's a steady flow, right? That it doesn't look like I did literally everything I could in year 5 before I went up for promotion and tenure. So there's that piece too. And we can talk through the logistics of that. We can talk through promotion and tenure processes if you'd like. So, you know, and I just did my 3rd year review in the spring, but I'm going into my 4th year as a counselor educator. So, and you know, the timelines are always like, as always, like certainly complex in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Melissa, I just saw your chat as well. What it looks like from dissertation to journal article. This is actually a funny question to me. When Gideon first reached out to me to talk today to you all and to talk about the writing process, I kind of laughed and I said, you know, I still sometimes feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. And as a matter of fact, I had, right before mine and Gideon's call, I had just gotten notice that my dissertation had finally published. I was a PhD student 5 years ago, y'all. So it took me a while to get it out. And I think maybe this kind of goes along with a lot of the themes that I'm hearing from you all today. But when I first started working on my dissertation, how many of you are in dissertation right now? Are there a few folks writing? Okay, yeah, 4. So maybe the 4 of you and can relate to this, and perhaps others if you've even just taken on a big writing project. You know, you immerse yourself in this specific area for so long. You have to become the expert on it, correct? And then I often have it, you know, call it like giving birth. You give birth to your dissertation, you put it out into the world. And then for me, I never wanted to touch it or talk about it or look at it ever again. I had spent so much time thinking about that I was like, okay, we're going to close that chapter of life for now. So dissertation to journal article looks a lot different for everyone. I would say probably the strongest determinant on how quickly you get that dissertation submitted into one or a few different journal articles is going to have to do a lot with your team. So if your dissertation committee folks are going to be carrying on as contributing authors. I think for me, I had, I'd lost touch with some of my dissertation committee members, and so I didn't have a lot of support there. And so for me, I was looking at this 300-page behemoth, or like monolith, and I'm thinking, I don't know how to pare that down into 25 pages. And so mentoring is such a huge part of that process, and guidance around like what to keep and what not to keep. But ultimately, and maybe this goes back to Carol's question, do we tailor our research to fit certain journals? When you start with something like a dissertation, something that is 100 to 300 pages, you already have the work. You already have it. It's completed. It's done. Your next step is to find academic journals that would best suit the work that you've created. Many dissertations, you can get a couple of different publications from it. So you're really looking to which journals publish the type of work that I've just completed, which journals are accepting manuscripts based on this type of research methodology, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methodology. Which topic area aligns, or which journal aligns with my topic area. And so in this case, you would be identifying an academic journal that does, fit with the work that you've already completed. I think, and Christian, did you publish yours? I remember reading your dissertation. I'm like, I read your dissertation recently because I just published an IPA study. So I saw it. It's good.
The dissertation. So funny enough, the empirical portion, I'm still in the process of finishing that up for an article. The conceptual pieces are already out there in the universe. So that was an ongoing process. And I think in many ways that did help with framing pieces that, related to who I am. And I think as we're hearing so many of these really beautiful questions and thoughtful questions, I think part of what we're also going to discuss today too is that I think we sort of think of writing as just the pragmatic, just the action, but it's tied to so much to who we are. And it's tied so much to sometimes our emotions, right? I was reading an article randomly, some random news article, saying, why do we procrastinate so much? And one is, these research studies actually point to the fact that the reason why we procrastinate is because we are avoiding a difficult task. And I think what's so interesting, I'm like, oh my gosh, I was like, I feel like I'm being attacked here. So there's that, but at the same time, I understood exactly what they were saying, right? And part of that is because some of the work that we do, it's not just the difficulty of the task that it feels insurmountable. There's the emotional difficulties. There's emotions attached to what we write. And so it can feel scary, it can feel vulnerable to be putting our work out there into these spaces. And sometimes we've known this, like I've shared with colleagues that some of the feedback that we can get can be microaggressive, it can be traumatic, it can be pretty heavy and dense, and it can be hard to process through all of it. And so I think, we also, as part of this community, we're offering that it isn't just that, we too feel vulnerable. Like, as much as we're in the midst of doing this work now, we still feel vulnerable, and we still feel like, oh my gosh, like this is rough sometimes. And I think in many ways, like that can certainly be helpful. So funny enough, the reason why it took me a little bit to really come back to working on the empirical portion of my dissertation for publication was because it is dense. And I think the other piece is that I was avoiding sort of because I knew that the dissertation process had a lot of emotional labor attached to it.
Yes.
And I also know that there was a lot of emotional labor attached to just the topic alone, because there was an element of me as the insider researcher, as someone who was a part of the community that I was working with. And so of course, like it's easy to bring up your own emotions with that process. And I think in some ways it's like, okay, I was avoiding that, but also I was avoiding some of the potential feedback, right, that I would get from colleagues in the profession on certain editorial boards, because I wasn't sure if people were ready to embrace this type of work, right? I mean, people have I teach intersectionality all day long, and people have a really hard time trying to grasp what is intersectionality. And I sort of had to figure out developmentally where people are at with that approach. And so I think in many ways, we're still, of course, like figuring it out, right? So, but I think as a point of encouragement, what I want to share is that I have seen some of the most prolific writers, visible scholars, not just within our profession, but within other disciplines. One, in fact, they tweeted this like months ago, but they said it took them 10 years to publish their dissertation article. And so I don't share that to incite any fear or anxiety. I share that to say, this is a normal part of the process, and it's okay. It's okay to be in your feelings. It's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to, that if you need to take some time, if you need to take a break from that dissertation article. So, yeah.
Yes, Christian, you are hitting on so many important elements of this. I think we're dispelling myths left and right. Writing is not just this mechanical rote task. It's emotional, it's vulnerable. It is sometimes blood, sweat, and tears. And also, I think, just even though you're talking to a sample of two, just Christian and myself, certainly dissertation may not be the first thing that you publish after you graduate. Right? It's very, very common that people do need to take a break from that research and try something else, or move into a different area of study, even something that they feel more freshness, more excitement about, after having kind of burned through the previous year of dissertation. So I think one thing that I'm also hearing woven into some of this dialogue right now is this sense of, well, the vulnerability of writing, right? And was it earlier, Lori was talking about the challenge of writing, dealing with an inner critic, and struggling with maybe perfectionism. And then I'm actually seeing some comments from you in the chat box around like you've been doing the work, you've been reading the readings, you've been digging into the research, but how do I even start? How do I even start the writing process? And I think one of the things, and Christian, let's just talk about this. One of the things I really wanted to accomplish in this presentation is to address exactly those questions, and describe some of the things that have worked for me. Lori, when you were talking, I was like nodding my head and being like, yes, I absolutely identify with that feeling, because that has been an aspect of my development as a writer researcher, is dealing with the kind of inner critic, the inner voice inside me that says, this doesn't sound academic enough, this doesn't sound smart enough, this isn't ready to go out. And ultimately that voice paralyzes us. It immobilizes us and stops us in the writing process. Surprisingly enough, maybe not to some of you, one of the books that was most impactful on my writing development was Stephen King's On Writing. Has anyone read that book? Okay, so Stephen King is, as many of you know, a very prolific writer. We could sit here and debate the literary nature of his writing. We will not. But let's say regardless of what he writes, he is prolific. And one of the things that I really, really like hit me to the core and reading his book on writing, writing is not something that Stephen King feels, he does when he's inspired. Writing is something that he does every single day, with or without inspiration. This is a work, this is a habit, this is a practice. Just like if you were learning to play the oboe, you sit, you wake up, you do your 2 hours of practice, and then you get on about your day. And you don't think about those 2 hours that you were practicing, or maybe you do. But you have this carved out time. What I found for myself, particularly around the time that I read that book, was that I was spending a lot of time during the day thinking about writing, but not actually putting fingers on the keyboard. Is that happening to anyone in here? Yeah. When you are maybe stressing about a writing deadline, maybe you've got a paper due for class, and you're thinking about what you want to say, you're thinking about the research that you've read, but you're maybe scrolling on Facebook, you're checking your emails, you're taking care of your family, you're doing the things that you have to do, and you're occupying loads of cognitive energy with just thinking about writing. And I found that to be one of the most fruitless aspects of my job, because I was stressing out about the writing that I had to do, the deadline that I had to meet. So I was thinking about it all the time. And in the meanwhile, I was immobilized. I was stuck in my tracks, because anytime I would sit down and pull up a Word document, I would write 3 words of my first sentence and say, I'm not ready to do this yet. And I would close it out. Oh man, I'm like seeing some faces in here. Yes, it's a thing, right? Close out your Word document and then go wash your dishes, or, go read another journal article. I think reading the sentence, reading the advice that whether you're inspired or not, whether you're ready or not, whether you're smart enough or not, write and get in the practice of writing, that completely shifted maybe not necessarily who I was as a writer, but how I was able to write. And that really marked a time where I started letting go of my inner critic. When you were writing every morning for 30 minutes or 2 hours, when you are uninspired, a lot of what comes out is garbage, right? And that's okay, because that's the point. You're writing something and you're getting used to seeing garbage on the page. And then every so often you see something and you're like, oh, wait, that's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to say. And you save that piece of text, or you save those paragraphs that you wrote down. And Lori, one of the things that I had heard from another kind of a prolific writer at the time was that we have a tendency to write a few words, go back and read what we just wrote, and then, play around with the thesaurus a little bit, update a word, change that, move some sentence around, and then start writing the rest of the sentence. And what that does is that interrupts our train of thought. It interrupts the coherence of what we want to say. So what I have been taught, and what I've found is probably one of the hardest things for me to do, is to free write, to get the garbage out, right? To sit down for those 2 hours and free write. Don't stop to find citations. Don't stop to do research. If I don't know what I'm trying to say in the sentence, I do an ellipsis, ... and then I keep going. So what happens is that I'm able to, first of all, get into my flow state, which for me takes me about an hour of writing. Honestly, the first hour of writing, even still to this day, is uncomfortable. And I'm like channeling my Hemingway, where I do feel like I'm just bleeding on the page. I'm like, God, this is so like painstakingly slow. But then once I hit that hour mark, then the ideas start to come out easier. My fingers are more nimble. I'm recalling things that I've been kind of tossing around in my head for the past couple of days. And my tunnel vision kind of closes in and allows me to focus more on the pages and the words that are in front of me. So once I hit that, you know, that moment of flow, I stop rereading those sentences, right? I stop rereading those sentences and I start kind of getting what is ultimately ends up being my voice on the page. After I stop, after I get to a good stopping point, I will tend to like stop, change gears, answer emails, go get a drink, go to the gym, do whatever I want to do. And then come back a few hours later and read through what I wrote. And what's always amazing to me is that when I go back to reread it, I read it with such less criticism than I do when I'm in the moment when I'm writing. I can see it and I'm like, wow, this makes sense. This is good. Like, you know what you're talking about. See, look, it's right here. And it is a feeling that inspires confidence versus, you know, shame. So I think having that bit of time between this very vulnerable, engaging, you know, sometimes heart-wrenching, sometimes painstaking process, when you go back to observe, analyze, and critique, having some space there really allows you to do that without attacking yourself, without harming yourself with your criticism. And that's maybe my story to talk about what had been coming up with you and your question and Lori as well. Christian, would you like to talk about your writing process?
Absolutely. I'm glad that we're on this part of the conversation because I think it's so important to discuss and weave our narratives into this process and to think about what sort of our identity as writers, right? So I think what I certainly think of here is, for me, I think about like our journeys, right? And our journeys in terms of like where I started, where I was 5 years ago, where I was 3 years ago, and who I am now. And I think part of what has been so consistent for me is I write not only from a place of just because I believe in the things that I'm writing about, but I write from a place of love. And I think that's what is so important, is that it's writing from a place of love, like loving the work that we're doing, loving the work that that we know, like we hope, because it's like, it's from that place of love where we're really connecting to our heart, and our heart in the work that we're hoping to alter some of the discourses in the profession. And I think that is where that place comes from. I think consistent with what Dr. Speciale shared with us, that so much of what we do is also tied into our positionality. Part of I recognize this is a very explicit barrier for many people, but sometimes the barrier to writing is because sometimes it's not just the emotional difficulty, it's not just the pragmatic difficulty, but our positionality matters a lot. And all the intersections that come with that positionality matter a lot. And I think what happens is that we experience all the effects of imposter phenomenon. I think for some writers, like racial battle fatigue, like it just happens. And I think that certainly we have to recognize that when it is happening, it sometimes blocks our process. I know that happened to me for a few months one time, where I recognized I was slowing down a lot. And it was because of certain feedback that I had received about some topics, certain feedback from other colleagues. Like, so it was like, wait a minute. And some that like, there were some blatant microaggressions in some of the feedback. And I was like, wait a minute. Okay, that's really awkward. But remembering that where I've connected to my work and found my joy in my writing over and over again is because I remember that is like, it's not just the emotional labor, it's the love that comes with that, right? And I think, you know, I'm by nature an extrovert, which on some days it's like, whoa, like I sometimes forget I am. And what also happens is that it's like, it's a love with our community, right? And I think that's something we can certainly discuss somewhere in the middle of our, or throughout our time together today, but it's the love of working with our community, and working with them in solidarity. And I think that's what emotionally connects us again to that work, and says, you know, this is not, as hard as this labor is pragmatically and emotionally, that I am finding joy in it again. And joy is hopefully going to buffer some of that, the issues or the barriers that we are encountering when we get hit the ground running with our work.
Yes, Christian, thank you for talking about that, for speaking to that. The positionality piece is particularly salient. I'm seeing a lot of questions around like, what is the process? You know, what is this process like? What are the steps kind of production, as someone had just said, I missed it. Oh yeah, as Paula had said in the chat. And positionality is the first step, right? Those questions of who am I? What are my identities? What are my values? How might my identities prevent me from seeing, you know, other people's experiences, recognizing other phenomena that exist in the world? How do my values shape who I am as a researcher, who I'll be as a researcher, how I will come across as a writer? I think another question that is important is for us to take a look at ourselves and, you know, how do my identities hinder or enhance my ability to understand or access specific phenomena? One of the, again, I think I'm going back to Carol's question around how do we, you know, how do we form these early research ideas? And I think one of the things that comes to mind for me is, in order to tap into that experience that Christian was just describing, that experience of love, of having this deep, profound respect for, engagement with your research, with your writing, with the topics that you're exploring. In order to tap into that love, we have to be doing writing and researching that is congruent with who we are, congruent with our values, congruent with our desires for a positive world, for positive social change. And I know just first getting started and getting your feet wet with writing and research, it can be really challenging to kind of take a look at yourself and saying like, hey, what am I passionate about? Like, what drives me? What am I most curious about? And so maybe Christian, I don't want to put you on the spot with this at all, but I'm curious to learn how that process happens. And I can certainly speak to mine as well. But you know, when we go from this feeling of like, I feel this, I feel strongly about this, I feel passionate about this, to an actual research idea, right? Like, how do you shape that into something tangible?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think the first piece is recognizing that I don't separate my personal and professional selves, right? Like, they are very merged together. And so the person who I am professionally as a counselor educator, as a researcher, is also the same person who I am personally. And so I think just how Dr. Speciale was sharing, what we do, right? It has to be aligned with our values and something that we care about. And sometimes that's where, you know, even if there's crossover in our collaborations on certain topics that can feel a little more distant, but sometimes if they're housed within our research agendas, they still are, there's still places that we care about, right? Like pieces, topics that we care about. So I'm thinking about how do I take an idea and move it to publication? And this is a great question, because I think sometimes, yes, it's like it can stem from conversations that we have from our colleagues, our dear friends, our conversations from conferences, from networking, but also at the same time, really tapping into seeing what those gaps look like and seeing how to really, really pare down and narrow what the problem is, right? So like your so what, and that's essentially what describes your introduction in your lit review, is I need to create this argument that says, so what, right? And sometimes, so I know there was a question about, do I create it for a journal or do I do what I want? And it's a balance of both. Because sometimes when I think about certain journals, right, like maybe, for example, relational cultural theory is, you see it all over in almost every article in the journal of creativity and mental health. But when you think about other journals where it should be there, it's almost virtually non-existent. And so what is practically interesting is that so many ways that we think about that, right? It requires a balance. And because sometimes it's like, okay, so I know, like, I've seen these experiences, I've observed them, but I'm wondering if there is already research on this topic within particular journals. Is there already research on this topic that supports the arguments that I'm already crafting? And also, are there research, or is there research that actually shows me, sort of like negative case analysis, it's like that shows me something contrary, right? That challenges the beliefs, the values, the arguments that I have. And because then it will help to frame the argument and figure out, okay, how do I need to convey this information in a way that can be helpful for this readership? And I think I know this is a little tangential, but because I've written in different disciplines, and like because my work on intersectionality cuts across different disciplines, I've been sort of like training myself to figure out, how do I write for different audiences? So interestingly enough, right, like I've seen this happen where in certain disciplines, they really like very straightforward technical language. Like it's just like, okay, so just be straightforward about it. Don't make it flowery. Where others, there would be like the theory, like, oh my gosh, like we love all this theoretical content that you're sharing with us. We really love that, you know, you've conceptualized it in this way. And some will be fully on board with very like philosophical construction of even a conceptual manuscript or an empirical manuscript. So I think that that certainly helps with some of the ways that we're constructing some of the work. What I also do too is, so I know that we can, sometimes we type some topics up into a search engine for our libraries, our databases, so we can do that on like public databases. But what I also do too is sometimes I actually, instead of doing that, I actually look in the journal itself. Like if you go to like, for example, Journal of Counseling and Development, JCD, I actually go to the journal website and you can search within this journal, and I actually search, okay, who's, I lead myself down the rabbit hole here, but I often search like, who's published on this topic? What has already been published on this topic in this journal? Because that also might help to figure out, okay, what are the conversations? What's the kind of, how do I need to think about this process, the construction of my work in a way that will meet the readership of this audience?
That is such a great point, Christian. The phrase "standing upon the shoulders of giants" comes to mind. I think what can often happen is we are struck by an idea, something that we feel very passionate about, and we can be like, this is what I want to research. I want to research this. And then we can dive into this rabbit hole, and then we can all of a sudden kind of recognize, once we've already spent a lot of time and energy into writing and, you know, developing research, that projects have already been, you know, this kind of research has already been done in other areas, maybe outside of the field of counselor education. Maybe we've missed something by limiting our literature review within counseling and counselor education. So that's such a huge first step, is looking around and saying, who else is talking about this? I think particularly with action research, if you're doing research in tandem with and in collaboration with the primary constituency, it is important that each of us looks at ourselves and says, you know, if we're doing social justice research on a specific population, it is likely that that population is already doing research with and among themselves, right? So for me to come in as a white PhD, able-bodied, cisgender person and say, I know how to work with trans folks of color. Here, read my model. There's a bit of a gap here, right? So there's a bit of an oversight. As writer researchers, we also have to acknowledge the incredible privilege that comes with having a platform, a pedestal, a PhD, or the ability to publish, right? Whose voices are we amplifying and whose voices are we minimizing or stomping on top of? So I'll give you an example of this actually. I recently started moving into a different research area. I started looking into the area of consensual sex work. My research background is in sexuality. I started looking at, okay, well, the counseling field talks a lot about human trafficking, but we really don't have a sense of, well, what about folks who do this work consensually because they want to, and not because they're beholden to the work. So I start developing all of these research ideas. I'm even in IRB at this point, and thankfully, I came across a book on doing research with sex work populations, and it immediately stopped me in my tracks. This is a highly vulnerable population. This is a population that researchers love to kind of get a piece of and explore and do all of these studies on. But there are already sex workers who are doing this research themselves. There are sex worker scholars, sex worker researchers who are talking about this phenomenon intersectionally in really amazing ways. So it kind of presented a question to me where it's like, how does the field or how does this population benefit from me doing this work if this work already exists from a target member of the population? And I think that's an example, but perhaps just something to keep in mind, especially if you are doing social justice research, is to look around and say, is this work already being done in my community? Who is already doing this voice, and who is already doing this work, and how can I at least involve them into this process, amplify their voice, and have their work inform my work? It doesn't mean that we can't do social justice work. Like, I will continue to advocate for, the well-being of sex workers, but it's questions that I have to ask myself, right? I don't want to come in and bulldoze the voices of folks that belong to this population who are already doing this work.
I agree. I think the other point that Dr. Speciale made was sometimes, as Gideon also shared in the chat box that Dr. Teresi West Olatunji also shares, is that this part of what we do, right, when we're looking at the culture of the journal, we're also looking at some of the scholars, right, and making sure that we're attending to some of the ways that we're even thinking about representation on our writing teams, our scholarly teams, our research teams, and how we're also thinking about who we're citing, right? Citation practices, there's a politics to citation practices. That's why we see like the Cite a System movement. That's why we see like Cite Black Scholars. That's why we see like so many of these other movements that are so important to shifting that narrative to say, you know what, we have to be mindful about who we're citing too, because if we're not citing people from the communities, then we're also basically saying that what kind of value are we crediting for the communities who are doing the work already within their own communities?
Yes, absolutely. Seeing some conversation happening in the chat box, but maybe it's a good time to check in and see if there are questions coming up right now. Yeah, I see Melissa and Carol. Melissa, come on in.
Okay, Carol. I have a question. So are you brainstorming by yourself, or are you collaborating with someone whenever you're kind of in this thought process of trying to decide which is your next research project to pursue? And whenever you do kind of start that process and getting it into tangible steps, I mean, again, is this something you're doing by yourself, or is it a collaboration?
I can speak to that for myself. Thank you for that question, Melissa. So my answer is, I think both. It's going to be happening both. Ideally, it should be happening both. Here's one thing that I noticed in terms of my adjustment from being a student to being faculty. So as a student, we are in learning communities. We are in classrooms, either physically or virtually. We are in discussion boards. We are, there's one book and we're talking about the ideas from this one book or this one research paper or this one film. And the exchange of information, I think, was one of the things that really helps you become creative. It helps you to, generate new ideas and to feel incredibly excited about work when you are among people, when you are within a learning community. When I transferred to a faculty position, I felt for at least the first couple of years that I had lost that. I was no longer a student. I was no longer in class. And I was building my community, what felt like kind of from scratch. I certainly had colleagues at other institutions, but I was at a primarily teaching institution. So I was doing a lot of teaching, didn't have a lot of spaces that were specifically designed for the exchange of ideas. And so that's a period of time where I had, primarily the research ideas that came out of that period of time needed a lot of refinement later on because I was operating essentially in a vacuum. I was doing all the things that Christian and I were just talking about. I was looking to the literature. I was doing all of those things, but it was just me. It's just myself with my cultural blind spots, with my, lapses and experience and all of the things, with just all of my limitations as a single person. And so I was able to see what it's like to be among a community of researcher writers and kind of operating within a silo. And I wouldn't wish that upon anyone ever, because it's exhausting. And writing a research manuscript, especially a qualitative one, all by yourself, I wouldn't recommend it. Those of you in dissertation know how bad that sucks. Just don't do it. Collaborate. The research process is so much more invigorating when you have people to talk to. It also strengthens the quality of the work that you're doing because you have an extra set or two of eyes on your, on the process, the accountability, the expanded scope of literature review, the checks and balances within the methodology, and then the shared work, the shared nature of the work in the end. So when it actually comes to writing up the manuscript. So I would say, do that. So that soul searching, that internal process, hell, do it in therapy. I have had some really incredible conversations with my own therapist about my writer researcher identity, especially when I am writing about my identities, when I am writing vulnerably or more creatively. These are things that it's so important to have a point person to talk about, but a lot of that process is internal. But then when I'm ready to actually execute, to go into action, that's when I'm like, okay, Christian, like intersectionality. Yes, like this is woven into this topic. Like, are you interested in working this? And oh, okay, Gideon, like I know that this is an area that you're really interested in. Do y'all want to have a conversation and just talk about this? In the first 15 minutes of that conversation, Christian and Gideon are both going to be like, but did you think about this? And I'm going to be like, oh my God, the project is so much better now. So do both. Always do both. Even if you're writing as a sole author, talk to your mentors, talk to your advisors, talk to your students if you're teaching, talk to your partner if that is part of, if that's part of your relationship, but get that extra point of view. I think that's such an important process. It helps kind of take all the weight off of our shoulders. Christian, thoughts?
Yes, yes. So speaking in addition to Dr. Speciale's points, what we often see, right? So I think you can think about this in multiple systems. So I still am on collaborations and research projects. I'm no longer at Idaho State University, but I'm still working with colleagues and students from ISU on research projects. I'm now working with colleagues and students at UNCG on research projects. So I think in many ways, so part of what we do, right? It's like there are connections that we create across the profession. And there are also connections that we can create within our own, not just within our own academic units, so not just within our own departments or programs, but sometimes with like, for example, like I think what was really cool was I actually got pulled into a large-scale federal grant application because of some of my work around equity, right? Like equity, particularly in health professions and health services and health equity. And so what we were talking about, so I ended up on a team with a physician assistant studies faculty, a public health faculty, Spanish language. So we were like creating this team together, and we all thought differently, but it comprised a much bigger conversation about some of the community work that we're doing that's attached to this particular research project, right? So really trying to transform this into a community engaged research project. I will say that some of the really useful tools, because I also recognize not everybody has the resources, right, to show up at a conference in person to get that registration. And so I also want to be mindful about access and equity for a lot of our students and our colleagues. And so for some, I think sometimes even reaching out, sending an email saying, hey, I know this is so random, like trying to make like a personal connection sometimes can help. Or like, I can remember, I mean, that's happened in many ways, like, because then people will think of you, right? Like I've had colleagues who do that for me, but colleagues that certainly when I create an edited volume, like I have people that I'm going to reach out to. And that's happening now actually. And then I have the other way around where there are people who consistently reach out to me to write for some of their textbooks, a chapter in their textbook here or there. And so I think that that certainly helps. Like sometimes sending an email to connect, like can certainly help, right? And sometimes it warrants a further conversation like this one on Zoom. And so I think on many ways, like people will, people have reached out to me and for consultation, people have reached out to me for, to connect about their thoughts about scholarship and potentially working together on projects. And we've just had Zoom conversations to figure out, okay, what does my bandwidth look like right now? And how can we create this project so that it becomes this topic that brings both of us joy too, right? So I think that's the other piece. What I also will offer is that sometimes what happens in the conversation, so be like among me, Dr. Speciale, and Gideon, like what we could probably, this has happened in so many different cases where I've had conversations, and because we need to pare down the idea, right? Like we start really big and broad, but we can pare down the idea that it becomes a series of projects, right? And that's where sometimes we can also negotiate discussing rotation of authorship too. So that way it doesn't feel like it falls on like one single person to lead every project. Or sometimes what happens too is we want all of us to succeed as a part of this community. And so we know that it's not helpful if somebody only shows up as third author on everything. So being mindful of that too.
I'm thinking, oh, I'm sorry, come on in.
Sure. Oh, thank you. Just want to thank both of you for really such helpful and insightful sharing. I have two questions. The first one is, as a doctoral student, when you don't have work to show for, when people don't know you, and then when you don't even have a solid idea what you're going to specialize in, how do we build collaboration? And people, how do we reach out in a way? So that's one question. The second question is, it's specifically to me, but just asking anyway. So as an immigrant, as someone who somehow is in between cultures or in a minority culture, and when you don't see a community around, when you feel like your colleagues, your classmates are forming communities, but somehow does not include you for whatever reason, then what do you do? So thank you.
Well, those are both excellent questions. I can speak to the first one. I think one of the things that was very, very helpful for me in the beginning when I was in that kind of interim space, like you described, like you are a writer, you're becoming a writer, but you don't have these established products to show for it yet. Two things come to mind. So first of which is I remember when I first got started doing my research papers for my doc program, one of my professors, Dr. Christopher Goodrich, if any of you all know him, he is a very prolific writer on the topic of LGBT issues, but Chris was my teacher mentor. And Chris says, every paper that you write for me, that you write for this program, make sure it's important to you, that it's about a population or an issue that you're passionate about, and try to publish it. And that's not typically something that a lot of us can do. A lot of journal articles don't want to read our, basic literature review on working with LGBTQ teens, but it was a good kind of, I guess, an intention that I would set for every class research paper that I would write was, I want to make this compelling enough, important to me, yes, but also compelling enough and hitting that gap, finding that gap in the literature. So this could be potentially publishable. And what ended up happening, honestly, is I had a pile of papers that weren't publishable, but between them, when I started actually creating new research projects, I was able to copy paste paragraphs from lit reviews that I had submitted, and update them and, kind of reword them because time had passed. But I had kind of viewed those assignments as potential, at least like some foundation for projects later on. And that was really, really helpful, at least with giving me some material that I could potentially use in future papers. So work smart, not hard, right? Another thing was conferences. And now in the age of virtual conferences, I think this point still applies. For folks like me, I'm working in the area of sexuality. There's not a lot of people that do this. So it was very easy to build community around it because we all attended each other's presentations. I saw the same, 15, 20 people sitting in my audience because I had just sat in their audience when they were presenting on sexuality, 3 hours earlier. So one of the things that, again, I think this was Dr. Chris Goodrich that instilled in me was those are learning communities, and we are paying top dollar to access those spaces. So do not let them go to waste. Do not leave a conference presentation without an email address and without like a handshake or, at a virtual conference, a private message, a DM. Definitely reach out to people whose work you are interested in and just who personally seems like a cool person, because we always need new colleagues in the field. Those are just two ideas that I have.
So I will also say, I know that I also think the question is a question of whether I know my areas of interest and what I'm passionate about, and also a question of how will I also specialize, right? So I think what I will also say here is don't discount the ideas that you have. Because I think here's what happens, right? Like, I think sometimes it's like, okay, well, because I'm not in a faculty position, that means that I can't write, right? Like, or that I need to wait to be on a project with my faculty. I've actually told doc students, I'm like, don't wait for a faculty to invite you. Like, just do it, just do it. And if you need me, I will support you. And if you need me to write with you, I will do that. If you don't need me to write with you and you just need moral support, I got you. Like, so there's that piece too. It doesn't require that, like, don't discount the ideas that you have, because they are valuable and they are going to be something that changes the course of our profession. So I think in many ways, that's what I want everybody to hear, is that don't allow anybody to tell you that your ideas are not valuable. And the second piece is that there will always be a home for it, right? So it's funny, I was telling Dr. Speciale last week, I was like, sometimes it takes your sixth journal. It takes a sixth journal. Sometimes you're so exhausted with it, you're like, oh wait, I'm so over this now. And like, but you get to a point where the sixth journal, and finally it gets published, and it's like, oh wait, it's a pretty good journal too. And it's like, it took the sixth journal. It took finding its own home that it finally worked. And I think any of these ideas, like, especially depending on where you're at, I know that, for example, when we're on the tenure track, only certain things count, right? But I think especially at transitioning from doc candidate to faculty member, the other plus side is that sometimes I think we want to discount, like say if we're like, okay, well, regional journals, like maybe here nor there, right? But like sometimes like some of our regional ACES journals are actually really, really solid research journals. And they're still waiting to get more visibility sometimes. But I think even as rigorous journals like that are open access, I think they are still good places to think about, where do I want to market my work? And so I think that's another place where you can certainly think about thinking about, how do I want to maximize my impact? Same thing with, like, I see this issue because I think sometimes what happens is like, okay, well, sometimes you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm just going to submit it to one of the state journals. Like, I think, like, for example, Texas Counseling Association, which they have a pretty robust research journal. So I think in that vein, like, people say, oh, but it's a state counseling association journal. I'm like, but it's also published on Taylor and Francis. So, so I think that's the other piece. Like, that's a point that I certainly want to make, is don't discount your ideas, and don't let anybody tell you that they're not valuable. So here's what I will say too, is that with your community, have someone who, yes, there are people in your life friends who will keep you accountable, but some who will also say your ideas are valuable, and your ideas are worthy, and remind you of that, right? Because I think when imposter phenomenon creeps up on us, we assume that our ideas are no longer valuable, and we get in our own way, and it sucks. It sucks. And sometimes that happens, and sometimes you need your community to tell you, you know what, I think you don't let the idea go. I think you should submit it. I think you should submit it. And that's happened for not only for me, but for some of my own colleagues, where I'm still cheering them on, saying, your ideas are valuable. I think you can submit it. And sometimes it does need to take your fifth or sixth journal to get that home. Oh, and then the second question about it was about like trying to find community in places where you don't have community. So here's the hard part too, right? It's like sometimes it takes a little bit of a slower time or a longer time than sometimes we had hoped, right? And I think there's differences, because I think all of our doc programs are different. There are some where they really encourage like cohorts to write together, and there are some where, you know, it's not, everybody's sort of on their own path. Like some people just want to finish a PhD and go into private practice, or want to serve as a college counseling director or anything to that effect. Some are not really focused on going into the faculty track, especially a tenure track faculty position. And so sometimes it does require you to say, okay, well, do I need to look outside of my institution, or do I need to do some of this work on my own first? I mean, so so in some ways, like I will be fully transparent. I was not given a GA position nor a research assistant position. So I wasn't quite connected to some of my own faculty in my doc program in order to produce all this work, right? I just said, you know what, I'm going to read and try to figure out how to do this and teach myself how to do this. So I started doing that was I started reading and figuring out, okay, what might this look like? Reading some of the articles that are in this journal, reading some of the programs where some of these conferences are held. So what can proposals look like? And never trying to shut the door on myself, because I just said, you know what, I'm just gonna do it. I'm gonna submit it and see what happens. So it's like, again, like that's two-pronged, like don't discount the ideas you have, but sometimes it might require that you do some of that work on your own at first, and maybe in some points, and then you'll continue to find community in that way.
Just want to say thank you, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you all for your questions. And I realize we have just limited time left. And before we headed out, I wanted to, and I'm inspired by Christian and Yun, your question as well. I want to challenge each of us, including myself, including Gideon and Christian and everyone sitting in. Gretchen, I'm looking at you too. I'm going to challenge us this week to reach out to a person or people in our lives who we also know is working on their researcher, writing, academic development. So you all have a captive audience here. So maybe make a note of someone in this room even that is lighting up by this challenge. That looks like a very safe person to reach out to, and set aside 1 hour in your next week to do a virtual writing workshop. Okay. Maybe a workshop is the wrong idea, but a virtual writing meeting. I was invited to a mentorship program through AERA for early career researchers. And this was one of the things that I left with that have also changed my writing trajectory. Each week in my Google Calendar, I have the 2 hours, because I told you an hour is my sweet spot. So I have 2 hours booked. It's an open an open writing meeting where I invite my colleagues and we sit on Zoom, we do not talk, and we write together. And I minimize the screen so I don't even see them, but we check in for no longer than 5 minutes. So we come in, we say, how are you doing? What are your goals for today? And we list anywhere from 3 to 5 goals about what we're working on for that next 2 hours. People are free to come and go. You do what you want to do. You can close out your screen. You can turn your video off, but we're there and we're accountable to each other. And I swear I am never as productive as I am in those 2 hours. So I challenge everyone in here to try and create that space with a colleague, with a friend, this next couple of weeks. See what happens. Silence your inner critic, just write, get the garbage out. That's the good stuff. Yes.
I'll jump in here. And
yeah, attend the next meeting. Gideon, I'm reading about it right now. This sounds amazing.
Yeah, y'all should come. I mean, I've been shamelessly plugging stuff in the chat box, but yes, I think this is totally in line with some of what you're offering up. If we could, just by way of closing out, I think one of the neat things that both of you have really offered up is some of your own story and some pretty practical tips and tricks to try out. I'm wondering too, I mean, as experienced writers and researchers, could you kind of in your closing out reflections or comments, could you give some airtime to like, what were your biggest oopses or mistakes or blunders, like as you were beginning to like write and build your own researcher writer identity? I think that's something that I sit with related to like wanting to build the most perfect sentence, is also like wanting to be able to, sorry, this beeping behind me, wanting to also build like a clear linear pathway. And I think that's some of what you pointed to, is it's not really a linear progression, but it's starting, it's stopping, it's constantly like reflecting, and in some ways a cyclical approach. So I'll just lob that over to y'all to play with.
You're not messing around, Gideon. Thank you for that question. The first thing that came to the first feeling I think that I felt when you asked that question was fear, and how fear has limited me. My first couple of years as a writer, so this was, master's, PhD, right around that time. I think I was so afraid of rejection that I sat on a lot of writing samples and manuscripts that I never published. And in retrospect, sometimes I go back and read those. Sometimes some of them I published ultimately. Some of them just got dated and they were no longer relevant. But I was so scared of getting negative editorial feedback that I didn't submit it. So I sunk hours into writing projects and then just never did anything with them. And I think one thing that Christian, you did so humbly and beautifully a few moments ago was talking about the kind of the tenacity that we all need to just keep submitting. That negative editorial feedback, actually, sometimes it can be microaggressive and really inappropriate. Like, that is also a thing, but it can also help us learn to become better writers. And it's free, y'all. It is a free process of getting writing feedback. Some journals have better writing feedback than others, and that process has been really challenging. I think kind of learning which journals are going to read your work, appreciate your work, and still give you very critical feedback, appropriate critical feedback. But do not be scared. Do not be scared of that feedback. That feedback will make you stronger as a writer, and who knows? They might just accept your work.
I have totally gone to that point where it was like this moment where I was thinking, I have no idea what happened. Like, I mean, it was like, you get into a flow of writing and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, oh, they actually accepted it. I was like, wait, that's happened. So that's happened. And I think in so many ways, I think what all right, so what I was going to say was that so much of who we are, the oopses, I'm trying to think of some. I think, here's the other piece about me that I think people get to know. I am so not about drama. Like, I do not like drama, and I'm like, no one needs drama in their lives. Like, we all got too much to do, so nobody needs drama. And I think, I've sometimes had to figure out, like, I think because, it's like when you have a lot of love to share, right? You almost think, okay, let me include almost everybody in like my, like, as a part of my community. And then I realized there were some people who were not really a part, like, who really did not necessarily were not there for community. And I think that was part of my, so I've had some, there have been a couple of times, it's been rare, but I've had some experiences where people were full of drama and they were petty. I mean, just all this extra stuff, and nobody needs that. Nobody needs that. So I think so it's okay to sort of figure out, okay, to be careful and to be selective about who you want to work with. And so that's okay too. And it's like, you can still, and it's okay. Like, sometimes it may not be the right time for that person too. And it's okay to work with them again, maybe a year out from now. But yeah, so sometimes that happens, but I think, you know, especially when somebody tries to start drama, I'm like, oh no, I can't with this. So I'm just not going to do that today. So that's, I would say that was one of my oopses, like, oh my gosh, hot mess. So, but I think in terms of closing, a closing reflection, I certainly think on that note, I think about like where that it takes a lot of heart work, not hard work, but heart work to do this work. And I think in many ways it is, again, a reflection of our community and the people that are part of who we are. And I will say that it is very consistent with what we're doing now in this collective. So much of where I found life in my work, where I found joy, was because of my community. And I taught the advanced multicultural course for the doc students this last spring, and a poem that I shared with them at the end of our last day of class was from Alice Walker. And so I'm going to go ahead and share this poem with you all, because my hope is that you will probably use this to drive your energy moving forward. My desire is always the same, wherever life deposits me. I want to stick my toe and soon my whole body into the water. I want to shake out a fat broom and sweep dried leaves, bruised blossoms, dead insects, and dust. I want to grow something. It seems impossible that desire can sometimes transform into devotion, but this has happened, and that is how I've survived. How the whole I carefully tended in the garden of my heart grew a heart to fill it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.